It's my pleasure to introduce Vanessa Robins today, and she will be speaking on persistence diagrams of bead packings. Thanks so much, Vanessa.
Okay, thanks Henry for inviting me to be part of this. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a nice application of persistent homology to this very old question in physics about the way spherical beads arrange themselves in containers. And this is work I've done with colleagues at ANU. So Mo Sadatfar and Nico Francois worked with the ANU X-ray CT facility to take images of real physical bead packings. And then Yasu Hiroka in Japan has helped with analyzing the persistence diagrams. And in the second part of the talk, I'm also going to discuss some work I did with Kate Turner, using this data as a case study for developing some statistical analysis techniques. Okay, so here are some pictures of what I'm talking about. And on the left, we have a visualization of a whole lot of spherical beads that were poured into a cylindrical container. And the beads all have about a diameter of 1 millimeter. And what happens when you pour beads into a container is that they tend to adopt a volume fraction of around 58 to 64%. So the configuration on the left here, the volume of space occupied by the beads compared to the total volume of space that they occupy with all the pores is around 64%. And what physicists have observed is that if you tap very lightly on the container, then the beads, it's very difficult to get the beads to pack more densely than 64%. All right, so with this very small perturbations, you can't really get denser packings than 64%. And this is in contrast to what we know the maximally dense packing of spheres is. So a crystalline packing of spheres will have a density of 74%. Okay, and this was actually something that was conjectured by Kepler over 100 years ago, but only just proven in the 2000s by Tom Hales. So that's quite an interesting story of mathematical proof there. And so I guess the kind of question that occupies physicists is, why do we get this energy barrier at about 64%? And what happens to the beads as they try to adopt configurations that are more dense? All right.
And Vanessa, so even if you shape the beads vigorously, they still don't do better than 64%.
No. So that's how. So the way my colleagues got these partially crystallized packing, yeah. So the packing on the right is a partially. You can see maybe that the domains look much more regular in that packing on the right.
Yep.
And that's because this packing has been subjected to much more vigorous shaking with, I think, a loose lid on top. Yeah, so, and the other thing I should mention is that the reason volume fraction roughly corresponds to energy is because the energy is the energy of the beads in a gravitational field. Yep, and so the height of the bead above the table is its potential energy, right? So if you can pack the beads more densely, then the configuration as a whole has a lower total gravitational potential energy. That's kind of correspondence between volume and energy going on there. Okay, so people have studied, this is a really nice, it's kind of like the idealized model of granular materials. So it's a very simple and a very idealized setting, but it forms the kind of simplest system for studying things like the way wheat grains sit in a silo, for example. Okay, so that's the kind of industrial relevance, is to real granular materials. Okay, so people have studied the geometry. So obviously geometry has a very important role to play here. And people have studied, for example, the Voronoi. You can imagine the beads as, you can imagine turning them into a point pattern by taking the center of each bead, and then you can build Delaunay and Voronoi diagrams from those point patterns. And so that's a very natural way to access the geometry of the local configurations versus the global configuration. And so a lot of people have studied these packings using analysis of the Delaunay and Voronoi diagrams. This example figure I've got here is showing the way the volume of each Voronoi cell, the way those volumes are distributed within a packing of a global volume fraction. So if the global volume fraction here is 59.8%, then that's quite a loose packing. Then the distribution of volumes in each Voronoi cell has this very nice distribution, which is a gamma distribution. And as the packing adopts more dense configurations, so higher volume fractions, you can see that distribution of the Voronoi volumes changes. Yeah. So that's just one example where people have studied geometric properties of these packings. And so I guess what the study I'm going to tell you about today was studying the topological signatures that we get out of looking at the persistent homology derived from these Delaunay triangulations. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit more about that. Okay, so the next slide is really setting up the picture for the idealized crystalline packing. So this is now, I've tried to tell you a little bit about the loose packings, right? And the fact that their Voronoi volumes are quite smoothly distributed. And now at the other extreme with the maximally dense packings, the way these are formed is by hexagonally close packed layers. So in a perfectly crystalline packing, you might start with one layer of hexagonally close packed spheres, and then there'll be the second layer of hexagonally close packed spheres is going to sit in the dips formed by the first layer, right? And now when you go to add a third layer, there are actually two choices of where that third layer can sit. So the third layer can either sit as I've drawn here, so that the red spheres are covering the little holes that were still visible between the green and the blue layers. Or the third layer could come back and sit on top of the A layer, right? So these, the way we can describe these crystalline closest packings is by stacks of these layers in different configurations. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that there is no unique solution to the densest possible packing. There's infinitely many possible ways to pack spheres at 74% volume fraction. And the other interesting thing is that they all have the same local configurations. So even though the global structure will be a little bit different depending on how you layer the ABC patterns, the local configurations will always consist of either tetrahedral closest packing or octahedral closest packing. Okay, so yeah, and they will occur, the tetrahedra to octahedra always occur in a ratio of 2 to 1. So, okay, yeah, and it's these, what we'll see and what physicists already understood in some way was that the signature of crystallization is the formation of these octahedra. And what we're going to see is that the persistence diagrams show that really clearly. All right. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, that was my bad. But
oh, that was your trying to ask a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I meant to unmute myself to ask a question. So these, the tetrahedral configurations, that's 3 beads or 3 sphere in one layer, and then the next sphere in an adjacent layer.
Yep.
For the octahedron, is it 3 in one layer and then 3 in an adjacent layer? Is that how I see this in the?
Yep, okay. That's what I was trying to show with the colors there. So you got the green and the blue, and the 3 green and the 3 blue. That corresponds to the 3 green and 3 blue in successive layers here.
I see. Thanks.
Okay, so let's talk about, I'll come back to that little barcode there, but I'll just set up the filtration for persistence. So since I'm talking to the applied topology group, I'm assuming you all know about persistent homology. But so the way I set up the data analysis is that Mo and the people here have come up with a really nice way to calculate the coordinates for the center of each bead from the X-ray CT imaging. So we're turning voxelized data into point coordinates with double precision because the bead centers are found as the center of mass of all the voxels that contribute to a particular bead. So we get very high precision point locations for the center of each bead. And then they can also estimate the actual radius of each bead. So you can, if you wanted to, you could do associate the actual bead radius with each point. But I think for the data I'm showing you here today, I'm mostly just doing the straight Delaunay triangulation. I'm not doing the weighted Delaunay. Okay, so now we have points in R3, and we can build the Delaunay complex from those points and construct the alpha shape filtration. So this means that so the alpha shape filtration is really capturing the topology of the union of virtual balls of radius alpha centered on each data point X. Yep. And hopefully everyone knows the Delaunay-Voronoi construction, where the Voronoi cell is the region of space that's closest to this data point than any other data point. And then the Delaunay triangulation represents the geometric dual to that construction. And the alpha shape turns out to be the nerve of the union of balls of radius alpha. Okay, so that's how the data analysis is set up. And if we imagine putting in a perfect crystalline packing and calculating the persistent homology for that packing, then in the zero-dimensional homology, the points all start, right, the connector components start as points. And so as I increase this virtual ball radius around each point, they're all going to connect when I hit the radius of the balls, right? So radius equals, when I hit the radius of the balls, I'm going to go from being isolated points to fully connected, okay? And then as soon as my virtual spheres start overlapping, I get a lot of cycles, and those cycles are associated with the equilateral triangular faces formed by the 3 beads just starting to overlap. And those cycles will get filled in when you hit the circumradius of an equilateral triangle. So that's 1.15 times the bead radius. And when you start filling in all those equilateral triangles, you close off little enclosed cavities. All right, and so those cavities can either be tetrahedral cavities or octahedral cavities. And the tetrahedral cavity has quite a small interval of persistence, whereas the octahedra have a much longer interval of persistence. So this 1.22 times the radius is the circumradius of a tetrahedron, and 1.41 is the square root of 2, which is the circumradius of a regular octahedron, and also a quarter. I don't know if you can see a quarter octahedron here. It's a right-angled tetrahedron formed by these 4 beads. So the diameter of that octahedron is square root of 2 times the radius. All right. So there's lots of beautiful geometry in there. And these numbers over on the right are telling you kind of the multiplicity of those intervals, roughly, per n beads. So if you have n beads, you're going to see roughly n H0 bars, 4n H1 bars, and then octahedra to tetrahedra in a ratio of 1 to 2. And that's very approximate. Okay, because I'm not including the boundary effects. So these are not exact numbers here because they'll be adjusted due to the boundaries.
And question, so if you stack the red layer differently in your other choice, you still get the same persistence, is that right?
Exactly. Yep. So there, So this regular persistent homology can't tell the difference between the ABA layer or the ABC layer, but there's someone, one of Herbert Elders-Brenner's students, looking into ways to detect the difference between those layers. Okay, so so this was just my caveat about using Delaunay complexes is nothing new in sphere packing, but the persistence diagrams are giving us a different way to summarize the information contained in them. Okay, so let's have a look. So what we have is, So what we have here is the PD1. So this is the first order homology diagram for, I haven't got my little picture here. So this is the loose packing fraction about 59%. And we're looking at the one-dimensional homology. So this is the cycles formed by local configurations of beads. And we'll just have a look at what happens between 3 different experiments. So each experiment has around 150 to 200,000 beads in them. And the way I'm drawing these persistence diagrams is just the birth radius versus the death radius in the alpha-shaped filtration. And then, because there's so many points in the diagram, I'm just creating a histogram of frequencies. So what you might see there is that as I increase the packing fraction, I'm kind of condensing down on that equilateral triangle hotspot there. Okay, so if we look at all 3 in one go, you can see that the distributions become narrower as I increase the packing fraction.
And Vanessa, Vanessa, the color is sort of the number of points nearby?
Yeah, so it's a logarithmic scale. So the red's up at 10,000 persistence points in those little grid boxes, and these little scattered ones are really just one bead, like one persistence interval. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep. So I'm going to come back and talk a bit more about what this all means. I'm just trying to give you a picture of the data to start with. So here we've got the second dimensional persistence diagram. And so this is telling us about the cavities that are formed between beads. And this is the lowest packing fraction. so a loose packing, and then one at 63%, so just below the Bernal limit, and then the partially crystallized packing here. Okay, so there's a really significant, I think you can see PD2 is showing up a very significant change in these local cavities. All right, so let's pick this apart in a bit more detail. So now I've just taken a smaller subset of random close packing. So we've just taken out a cube of 14 millimeters cubed. So that's 14 bead diameters, and this subset happens to have a volume fraction about 63%. Okay, so PD1, the most prominent feature in PD1 is this vertical line and then that curve heading off. Okay, so this vertical line is due to, so the birth here is radius 1. So this is 1 times the bead radius. So I think my previous figures were in centimeters, but now I'm doing relative units, so I've divided by the bead radius. So the birth is all at 1, which means I've got spheres in contact. All right, so I get a cycle is born when I have a little cluster of beads that are all in contact. Okay, and if I've got 3 beads of mutual contact, I've got an equilateral triangle, so that's my hotspot down there. But if I have a kind of square configuration that's a bit skewed, right, then I could have 4 spheres in contact, and I'm going to have a larger value for the depth radius. Yep, so that's what's going on in that distribution there. And then along this curve here, my birth radius is getting bigger. So that means what's going on here is that I have a little cluster of 3 beads where 2 pairs are in contact, but the third pair isn't quite in contact. So I get a slightly larger birth radius, but it's still an acute triangular configuration. So this is my depth values along there. And the same kind of thing is happening in PD2. So in PD2, this curve along here we can understand as being built from semi-regular tetrahedra. So the hotspot down there is the perfectly regular tetrahedron with 4 spheres all in mutual contact. Whereas if I go up along this curve, that's formed by one of those spheres just rolling away from its opposite pair. Okay. So now in the crystalline packing, I've chosen a subset with extremely high volume fraction, so it's at 72%, where the maximum is 74%. And so you can see almost all the PD1 features have collapsed down on that equilateral triangle point, with just a few looser packed beads. And then here I'm seeing that regular tetrahedron and regular octahedron hotspots very clearly. So they're both born at the circumradius of an equilateral triangle. Okay, oh, here are my pictures. Yeah.
So, question in the non-crystalline case, you don't really see a hotspot near the octahedra. Maybe there are a couple octahedra.
No. Yeah. It's very, very much missing.
Okay. Yeah. It's sort of a rare event in the
yeah. Yeah, we'll see that very clearly as the picture goes on. Yeah. So I guess what was really nice about working with Yasu's group was that he's developed some code that really can take a point in the persistence diagram and go back into the geometric data set and tell you exactly which beads contributed to creating that topological feature. Okay, so using that, we were able to really confirm that these are the types of deformations that were going on when following those prominent pathways through the persistence diagram. So we identified 4 different deformation pathways. One of them is starting at a regular tetrahedron and just rolling one bead across the top there. And the other one is a kind of symmetric deformation of a tetrahedron where the top and the bottom pair of vertices slowly move apart and collapse down into a square. So this is a symmetric deformation from a regular tetrahedron down to a square planar configuration. And then the octahedral deformations, this D4 one is where you've got a regular octahedron and you just roll one bead across the top. And in D3, we've got another symmetric deformation where the top bead and the bottom bead push down, and the square in the middle here deforms into a rectangle. Okay. And from these models, we can derive analytically the persistence diagram signatures, and we see that they line up very nicely with the dominant features in the persistence diagrams. Okay, so this is in our partially crystallized packing. We're seeing that first tetrahedral deformation and the second tetrahedral deformation really bound the distribution of those features down there. And the 2 octahedral deformations, you can see, by capturing those highlighted regions. So if you look back in the persistence diagram here, you can really see those areas of the persistence diagram with many more points, right, than the others. You might also notice this another hotspot right on the diagonal here. So that's due to right-angled configurations. So if you have a right-angled triangle or a right-angled tetrahedron, then your birth and your death values in the alpha shape filtration are the same at the square root of 2. So that's what this hotspot on the diagonal is. So that's associated with octahedral configurations because you've got those right-angled tetrahedra forming the octahedron. So the other interesting feature in this persistence diagram are these little clusters of points that are occurring at the same birth radius of the equilateral triangle. So anything occurring in that vertical with a birth above the equilateral triangle radius is going to be what's known as a deltahedron. So a deltahedron is a polyhedron which has all equilateral triangle faces. And so when in the persistence diagram, when we hit that equilateral triangle radius, we fill in all the faces of the deltahedral cluster, but we're still left with a cavity inside. So this little point here is due to some 9 bead clusters, and these ones up here are due to missing bead defects. So that's when you've got crystalline packing all around you, but for some reason one bead is missing out the middle. Okay. So the other really nice point about this story is that so everything I've shown you so far has just been from these experimental packings, but Mo went and did some numerical simulations to demonstrate that these features are really relevant to a more dynamic picture. So if we start with a perfect crystalline packing of beads and we imagine shearing that packing from the bottom, so we're moving that bottom plane and simulating the forces that move all those other beads around. Then we track the persistence diagrams according to how long we've been subjecting the packing to shear. Then this is the sequence of persistence diagrams. So we go from having hotspots at the tetrahedral and octahedral hotspots, as you expect, to the distributions blurring out and following those tetrahedral deformation pathways and the octahedral deformation pathway there. Until eventually, when we get down to that 63% packing fraction, we're back in that very diffuse cloud and there's no octahedra left. Okay, so that was a nice confirmation of what we were seeing. And okay, so now I'm going to kind of move into the way I use this data set as a kind of a nice case study for some statistical analysis. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is to do a kind of statistical analysis of what's going on, we looked at a whole lot of subsets of our three experimental, so that we had three experimental data sets and they have on the order of 1 to 200,000 beads. So what we've done instead is take smaller subsets with around 3,000 to 4,000 beads in them, and we look at their persistence diagrams and we see how those persistence diagrams change with the packing fraction. All right, so there's a little video here that shows you what happens, and it may play too quickly. I couldn't figure out how to slow it down. But there should be 36 images in this sequence. So we're starting at a low packing fraction. Oh, here we go. Maybe I can do it like that. Slide it. So here we're starting at about 59% packing fraction. And then we're going to scan through increasing packing fraction. And you can see kind of how that octahedral hotspot is starting to form as we get into the partially crystallized packings. And at the highest density end, we have those two hotspots appearing and less points elsewhere. Okay, so the case that, so we want to analyze these in a more statistically rigorous fashion. Oh, hang on, I've gotten out of sequence. All right, sorry. So we're going to try and analyze this data in a more statistically rigorous way. And people have been, there's lots of different ways people are developing at the moment to do statistical analysis of persistence diagrams. And the way Kate Turner and I developed in our paper was to look at the rank function. So the rank function means we transform a persistence diagram, which is a collection of points, into something that's really a function in the plane, a function of two variables. So the rank function is defined at each point in this upper quadrant, and it says, so Betty, the rank function at the value x and y is telling us the number of persistence diagram points that are in that upper left quadrant. Okay, so we're going to go from a collection of points to a function defined in the plane here. So each point in the persistence diagram kind of generates a value of 1 in the function in that lower right quadrant. Okay, so this is just a very simple illustration of going from persistence diagram to rank function. Okay, and the reason we want to work with the rank function is because it really is a function. So when you have a function, you can define a function norm, and you can use some very standard statistical analysis techniques to take means and look at variance of those functions. Okay, so this is a very, it's not hugely sophisticated, right? Because we're just turning our persistence diagram into a function, and then we compute a pointwise mean of all those functions, and then we calculate the residuals, which is just the difference between each data function and its mean. And that's the sort of data we can do principal component analysis on. Okay. So PCA is really just about finding the dominant axes of variation in your data. And what we found is that in a subset of 36 sphere packings, we found that 97% of the variation was explained by a single dimension of variation. So that was pretty nice result, showing that really the persistence diagrams of these bead packings really do vary according to a single parameter, all right? Well, almost a single parameter. So at 97% confidence, we've got a single parameter controlling the variation. And if we look at two axes, then they explain 99.4%. Okay.
Question, Vanessa. So your
Yep.
your rank functions are functions, and then you had on the plot you had the mean rank function. Those gray curves, those were the level sets of that function.
Yeah, they're just the contours to help you see, to help you visualize the pictures there. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. So here's the projection of those function. No, so what we've done here is we project the residuals. So each data function minus its mean sits in some big functional cloud, right? But when we do PCA, we're kind of projecting that cloud onto a plane or one or two axes of variation. So this is what my data points here are showing is the projection onto the first two principal component axes. Okay. So you can see it's clustering the two disordered packings much more closely than the partially crystallized. So experiment C was the partially crystallized data, and you'd expect that because in the partially crystallized data you've got kind of crystalline domains and then loose packed domains. So there's going to be much more heterogeneity in those data sets. And if we, the kind of obvious natural parameter that is going to be controlling the variation is the volume fraction. Okay, so if we just plot the first principal component score versus volume fraction, then we see this very nice trend. And then the other step in our analysis was to go back and actually visualize the first PCA function. So that's what this little diagram here is showing, is that this is the function that represents that first dominant axis of variation. And what you can see is that the maximal variation is occurring about this point in the birth-death plane, all right? So it's occurring about 1.2 times the bead radius. So this corner here would represent so this corner is the regular tetrahedral corner, and this corner up here is the regular octahedron corner. But we're seeing the maximum variation across our 36 subsets is happening at this particular point here, okay? So if we plot the first principal component score against the rank function at 1.2, so this is really the second Betti number of the alpha shape formed at radius 1.2. Okay, so it's a very simple geometric thing, and we're seeing that single quantity, so Betti 2 of the alpha shape at radius 1.2, has a pretty much linear correlation with that first PC score. So that's pretty nice. And then if we look at this value, the Betti 2 of the alpha shape at 1.2, and we look at that versus volume fraction, we recover pretty much the same trend, okay, as this. So that's, we've just flipped the sign, right? So we've kind of backed out what our, we've kind of backed out a very simple geometric parameter that's correlating with volume fraction. And if we go back now to the persistence diagrams instead of the rank function pictures, we're seeing that what that Betty 2 counts is the number of persistence points in that quadrant there. Okay, so it's really counting the number of fairly regular tetrahedra and octahedra. Oh yeah, now this is where I got out of sequence, so I want to go back to that plot here. Okay, so if we break that down just a little bit more, we can separate out the tetrahedral area and the octahedral area, and we can actually just count how many tetrahedra and octahedra are in each subset. And you see the tetrahedra, the regular tetrahedra increases slowly and then much more steeply after that 64% disordered close packing limit. And the octahedra, there's almost no octahedra below 64%, and then they start to increase as you get more crystalline domains. And the plot on the left here is showing you how the ratio of tetrahedra to octahedra goes to that crystalline packing ratio of 2 to 1, so tetrahedra to octahedra. Okay. All right, so hopefully you've enjoyed that little story. I think it's a really nice case study, and the sphere packings were a really nice way to get that deep geometric interpretation of the persistence diagrams, because you can understand their geometry so easily because you've only got spheres of identical radius. But I guess I've also been analysing persistence diagrams of more irregular granular materials, so there's interesting stuff coming out of that. And the other point I really wanted to make was that packings of spheres and containers is much more than just their geometry, and my colleagues are starting to be able to get information about the actual forces between grains in a 3D assembly, and so we'll start to look at how to analyse that sort of information in a persistent way. So other people have looked at force chains in a 2-dimensional granular packing, but we're going to try and see what we can find in a 3D setting. Okay, thanks.
Go ahead and unmute yourself if you can, and let's thank Vanessa.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very nice talk. So, do we have questions for Vanessa?
Yeah, I have one question. So you use the Delaney triangulation and then use the check complex, and I
Yep.
just wonder what is the difference between just using directly the check complex from the point, and then using the Delaney triangulation and alpha filtration, and then use check complex.
Yeah. So the difference between them is not too significant for this 3-dimensional setting. The main difference is that the alpha complex doesn't introduce any tetrahedra of higher dimension. So in the check complex, as soon as you get 4 spheres, if you're in the plane and you have 4 disks overlapping, then your complex introduces a tetrahedron, and you don't really want that higher dimensional object in your 2-dimensional data. So the corresponding thing in 3 dimensions will be that when you get a if you get 5 spheres overlapping, you'll have to introduce a 4-dimensional simplex. So what alpha shapes give you is just a much better controlled data structure in terms of the dimension of the simplices that are involved. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yep, you're welcome.
I have a question too. I was wondering, when you take these subsets of your full data set, does it really matter the boundary effects, or is it still kind of a large enough set that that's not really affecting your data? And if it matters, how do you handle the boundaries?
That's a really good question. So for the persistence diagrams, I don't take the boundaries into effect. So for the statistical analysis, I have about 28 bead radius cubed subsets. So the boundaries will be influencing the points in the persistence diagram, but I think what they're kind of just contributing to these clouds up around here. All right, this is the stuff that's coming from the boundary. So I haven't made any attempt to correct for that in this data analysis, but I know when my colleagues, like at the beginning, when my colleagues were doing this volume distribution here, for example, then they would form the Voronoi cells for the full global packing and then just select out the Voronoi cells that belong to a subregion. So in this analysis, they're not seeing the boundary effects because they really use the Voronoi cell that's been influenced by the other spheres around, but which aren't officially included in that subset. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, great, thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Other questions? I had one last question, Vanessa.
Yeah.
So the check and alpha complexes, I think, are the natural complexes to use here because they measure the union of the balls. I could see how using some other complexes like a RIPS complex would lose information because you lose all these one-dimensional holes coming from triangles. Are there any different geometric features that might get not just lost but accentuated, or sort of is there more information to be gained by other geometric complexes, or do you mainly just lose information?
That's a good question. I thought it was quite interesting when I drew this barcode figure how tiny the length of that tetrahedral bar really was. So it kind of, in one sense, it's a very small feature, but in another sense, it's an extremely important feature. So if you're going to do RIPS, yeah, I guess it might accentuate these. So if you think about the one-dimensional complex, it might accentuate the cycles that are built from more than just an equilateral triangle. Mm-hmm. Yep. So that might be a good thing. Yeah, so it could accentuate the more global features or the more non-local, if you know what I'm trying to say. I think this is something I didn't talk about too much, but for example, all the points, there's a limit in the alpha shape filtration. You can draw a line here with a well-defined slope. And you can say that any persistence point that occurs to what am I trying to say? So you know, because our Delaunay tetrahedra are formed by spheres that are in contact, you can say that any Delaunay tetrahedron in my packing has to have a circumradius within a particular bound. And so if my birth-death point occurs outside that bound, I know that topological feature is formed by more than a single Delaunay tetrahedron. Okay, so the features in the persistence diagram up here are all formed by chains of tetrahedra that are kind of face sharing in the packing. Okay, so maybe a RIPS complex would highlight that kind of feature more.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much. Let's thank Vanessa one more time for a fantastic talk.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And let me end the recording.